We are here with our final session of today's Agile 100, and I'm super excited to welcome Rita McGrath joining us today. Rita was introduced to me through a shared friend, Alex Osterwalder, who was joining our very first Agile 100. Now this is number 15. And I've been following Rita's work for a few years now. And I think in 2019, Rita, if I'm not mistaken, you published Seeing Around Corners. And what I really liked about that book was you provided an answer to the question that a lot of my clients ask myself: how do we know when one of our business areas will be disrupted? And today you will share some of those thoughts with us. And you will also share a lot of resources where people can then later do a deep dive on some of the topics that you share today. And hopefully we will also have some time for a Q&A, for a conversation with you. Without further ado, Rita, I'm handing over the stage to you. Thanks for joining us.
How delightful. Well, lovely to see you. Lovely to meet everyone. What I thought I'd do, given the nature of this audience, is share with you some work that we're doing to help companies create more innovation capability. And this is through a company I'm calling Belize with my partner on Boer. And so think of this as like a sneak peek. I won't make a big, huge formal presentation over it, but I'll share with you some of the ideas, and then we can talk about how we might proceed to follow up. Because I know this audience is going to be particularly interested in something that's my passion, which is, for years I've talked about innovation and changing mindsets and looking at the world in a new way. And that's really important. I mean, if you don't have awareness, if you don't know that there's an issue, it's very hard to motivate action or, to do anything differently. But what I kept finding was people would hear these things, their minds would be changed, and then they'd go back to their organizations and now what do I do? I've got this hierarchy with its silos. I've got traditional ways of working. I've got the quarter by quarter pressures. I've got the opera. How do I change this in some meaningful way? So that's really what I've been working on, certainly throughout the pandemic, but for quite a long time, actually, a depressingly long time as I think about it, in terms of getting this thing to become real. So hopefully you can see my screen. Can you?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. So let me just share with you some of the things we're doing at the company. It's called Belize, which is meant to evoke a little bit of value realized, a little bit of portfolios of opportunity. And the core issue that we're grappling with is this problem. You know the world is changing. You're up against what some people call rogue waves or strategic inflection points. And yet the pressure of today is so intense that it's really difficult to carve out space and time for that little mouse. And if you don't do it, on the other hand, eventually, someone will. And then your little elephant's going to be in big trouble. So that's a lot of what we're trying to work on at Belize. And the website is belize.com, BALIZE.com. Tons of resources, downloads, all kinds of things there. So check that out once this talk is done. But let's start off with a basic financial conundrum, which is when you have a lot of certainty in your business. And I'll give 3 quick examples. Example number 1, the Columbia graduating business school class of 2018. Example number 2, our local regional theater company, which has had the same model of 5 shows a year, and each show has the same production price, and each thing has the same thing going for it. Example number 3, a real estate commercial developer who's got leases that run in 30-year cycles, and the demand for those leases is very, very predictable. Okay, so very low uncertainty, low variability situations. So you got a situation where, my business sort of is steady. It grows by 3% every year, and that's a nice thing. So low uncertainty. And in those situations, you can use a lot of the conventional tools that we teach in business school. You can use a lot of the conventional approaches that you're probably used to reading from management books and so forth. And here's the dilemma. As you move into higher uncertainty situations, what you're building is not present value in the sense of, I know what my rent is going to be on my commercial property every year. What you're building is instead option value. So it's the right to make a future choice. Now, there's a couple of very interesting things about option value situations. The first is they tend to be collectively higher return on investment than anything you're going to get from a predictable, understood core business. But it's a high payoff. It's a blockbuster system, right? So most of the time they're not going to work out. The ones that work out with a vengeance. So you've got this problem of managing failure and disappointment, even though you know that the higher returns are there. It's how do I endure the pain of shutting down the ones that I need to shut down to get to the ones that are more valuable. Now, venture capitalists, good ones, think this way normally. So say they have 10 products or projects in their portfolio, 10 companies in their portfolio. 6 of them will die outright. 2 of them are going to kind of turn into zombie projects. I think it'll work. Just give me one more year. And 1 or 2 are going to pay off for the rest. And as they will tell you themselves, if I knew which ones were going to be the ones that paid off, I wouldn't invest in the others. But under financial uncertainty, you just don't know. So if you think about how you construct your portfolio investments as a company, so we're now saying, all right, you're General Motors or you're Unilever or something, and you're making investments. And I would argue these investments can be thought of across that range of uncertainties. So across the horizontal line, you've got uncertainties about markets. Who's going to buy it? How do I get to them? How will I distribute this thing? And on the vertical dimension, you've got uncertainty about technologies or capabilities. So can I do it? Is it even technically feasible? What are the regulations going to be? Will I be allowed to create a standard? And different kinds of projects have a different job to do for you, depending on where you are in this portfolio. So clearly your core business, investments there will keep today's business healthy. And that's great, right? Enabling work from home, doing a digital transformation, moving your infrastructure to the cloud. Those can be very innovative things, but you know how to do them and you know who you're doing them for. So this is the elephant, right? These are easy. These are easy to justify, easy to execute. I mean, maybe not easy, but relatively no. Moving out a level of uncertainty, you have what I call new platforms. Now, new platforms are very, very challenging for companies. And here's why. They require substantial investment or they will be doomed to fail. And I don't mean stupid investment, but they require a commitment because they're big-ish. They're candidates to be your next generation core, and they require both you and your customers to be committed to this future. So 2 great examples are Adobe. When Adobe decided to go from shrink wrap on-premises owned software to cloud-based rented software, it was a completely different business model. And they had to explain it to their customers, to their investors, to their other constituencies. And they had to explain that they were going to go through what we sometimes call a J curve. So in the popular imagination, people move fleetly from the growth cycle of an S curve to the growth cycle of the next S curve. No, there's this J curve in the middle where you have to make an investment, where sales go down, where everybody and their brother is looking down their noses at you, going, "Oh, you boy really screwed up a great business," blah blah blah. And yet, if you don't do it, you doomed that business. Similar, Amazon Web Services, right? To take this technology that they built for themselves and offer it to the world for sale. I mean, that's pretty ambitious. Now, you can't, go to a customer and say, "I'd like you to put your critical infrastructure on my cloud." And the customer says, "Oh, and you're going to guarantee you're going to be here in 18 months? And you say, "Well, no, actually not. We're just experimenting." That's not going to work. So you need to make a commitment. So in these 2 areas, right, these are fairly substantive investments. You don't want to have a lot of failure here. You do kind of have a sense for what your returns are going to be here. So they're on the more certain end of the continuum. Now, once you get into high uncertainty on either dimension, what you're looking at there is what I call options. So this is where you're creating that option value. High failure rates, high rates of return, but they have to be managed with a completely different discipline. So what we call a positioning option is a case where I know there's going to be demand. What I don't know is, what's going to meet the demand. So what's going to come after Zoom in the world of telepresence? I hear ABBA is now doing a world tour using holographic technology. I mean, woo! Now, do I like it? We'll see. But to me, that's an example of a positioning option. I'm making a bet that there's going to be a market for this thing. And if I'm in the world of telepresence, I want to know that I have my ear to the ground on what might happen. Scouting options, something different again. And this is a case where I have something I know how to do. How do I do a market test for it? And our friend Alberto Savoia has a great example. He teaches at Stanford. And one of his students had this great idea. They said, at the end of the day, the cafeteria throws away all this sushi that hasn't been eaten. And yet it still has, it hasn't expired yet. It's still good for maybe another day. So maybe we could go into a business selling, day-old sushi and charge a lower price for it. Wouldn't that be great? We're making a new market out of nothing. And so Alberto kind of looks at them and says, let's do a market test. So they go off and they buy some actual same-day sushi. They print a bunch of stickers. They call it second-day sushi. And they put it in the cafeteria and see if anybody would buy it at a cheaper price. Now, this was legitimately original sushi. It wasn't, they weren't taking risks with anybody's life or anything. Nobody bought it. So what does that tell you? It tells you maybe there's not a market for second-day sushi. But you've learned something, and that's not a failure. You spend $100 to figure out this idea isn't going to work. Infinitely preferable to building an entire business around something before you've tested the market premises. Next, you have what I call stepping stones. And stepping stones are conditions in which you're trying to learn something about a new market, but the market is still very undefined. It's still very big and amorphous and out there. And to listen to some people, autonomous vehicles is a case in point. To listen to some people, we have flying cars and the Jetsons around the corner. You'll be able to call, dial them into your phone. A drone is going to come to your doorway and pick you up and take you wherever you need to go. The technology is very good, but we don't have a regulatory regime, an ownership regime, a risk regime. I mean, there's so much that still has to be completed before we could have an autonomous car ecosystem. It's going to be a while, I suspect. However, there are places where you could find an early market. And the one that I've been watching with great interest is in the military. And the military has decided to use autonomous technology in its supply chains. So here's the problem. You've got, say, 7 trucks or vehicles that need to go to a front line to supply the troops. Well, the typical solution is you have 2 human beings driving each of these vehicles. Well, that's kind of a waste of human talent. And unfortunately, the autonomous technology isn't good enough yet to take over the whole job. But it's good enough to play follow the leader. So what you have now is the front truck has 2 humans in it, and then there may be 6 or 7 trucks daisy chaining along behind, each of them able to follow the instructions of the lead truck. And that's a perfect example of a stepping stone. It's a market that has a big problem, which you can solve using today's technology. They'll pay you very well for doing that. And what you want to be able to do is make profits on a niche, and then you expand that niche into the next niche and the next, and finally you get to your full market presence. And if you look at most systemic technologies, things like 3D printing or RFID or technologies like that, most of them went through this process of starting off in the market with a stepping stone, gradually expanding into larger and larger markets. So how many of what kind of stuff should you have in your portfolio? And I think this is a fascinating question. It's one most companies do not have a good answer to. And so I'll give you the example of an actual project we did for a medical devices company who said their strategy was all about, customer responsiveness and speed to market. And it wasn't happening. It just wasn't working. And so the CEO called myself and some colleagues in to have a look at what was going on. And here's what we found. We found a portfolio that was a complete mess, right? The strategy suggests that you should have a ton of stuff in the core, a few platforms to make sure you weren't becoming obsolete, and then, a couple of options to keep an eye on things. And when we looked, what we found was the center of gravity at this company was platforms. Everybody in the place wanted to manage a platform project because that's how you got ahead. in that organization. Nobody wanted to work on the core. That was for wussies. And options, ooh, too dangerous. You might lose your reputation for infallibility if you worked on options. And so what had happened in this company happens all the time. All the time. You have these fundamental disconnects between your strategy, right? Pulling you into the future. That's what it should do. Your budgets. Where does this year's budget start? Well, clearly it starts with last year's budget, right? So your budget anchors you backward. Then you have your project approval process, which often happens with complete disregard for strategy or budgets, and your process by which people feel they're going to be rewarded or not. And I think this is the problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to say, how can we create transparency and sort of organization-wide understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish here, so that it becomes very visible. And so we've developed a thing we call the Spark Hub, which stands for Strategy, Planning, Asset, and Review in a cadence. So it's this whole idea of a cadence, connecting your strategy, your assets, your planning, all that together. So we call it the Spark Hub software tool. And you'll see this is an image, this is a screenshot of the actual software. And what it does is each of these little projects is scored in terms of uncertainty, and it's placed on this portfolio by the software tool. Now imagine if you're a, I don't know, CFO or C-suite owner or something, you could go in every morning and see where your projects are, right? If you're a board, you could go in once a month and sort of say, let's show you where the projects are moving. We have the ability to take snapshots, so you could say, snapshot first of the month, let's compare that to the first of next month. You have the ability to capture certain kinds of data about these projects. And one of the most powerful elements of this particular system is it's built discovery-driven growth, the principles of growth under uncertainty right into the software. So instead of planning by month or by using some project management tool or everything, we actually plan by what we call key checkpoints, which are moments in time at which you're going to learn something. And what we try to do is we say, okay, my first checkpoint in this particular illustration is initial customer interviews. And I'm going to spend $2,000 to learn about initial customer interviews. And it says, what have I spent to date? What's been allocated? What's my budget? So now when your CFO comes marching into your innovation office and wants to know, what did you spend your $50,000 on? You could call this up and say, well, we did 122 customer interviews. We did a comprehensive competitor assessment. We built a prototype and we're in the middle of getting results from that. Now you can have a conversation about what the money's actually going towards. And it captures what you're learning. So I think that's a real breakthrough, because oftentimes, the elephant, right, is often your financial system. It's often your product and planning system. We've also connected this software to what we call the Learning Hub. So we've got the Spark Hub for managing the process and the Learning Hub for managing how you learn. And so here's the vision here, which is you've got these checkpoints: customer interviews, competitor analysis, building prototypes, revising the prototypes, creating a marketing plan, all these different checkpoints. So you got your team and you're working on them, and you get to a checkpoint, let's say it's prototypes, that you don't know anything about. Right? So what you do when you get to that moment in the system is you hop on over to the Learning Hub, and what it takes you through is a series of short, call them almost little learning module explainers. They're not like a huge, big course. They're maybe a 5-minute video, a reading you can read in, like a medium style article you can read in 5 or 10 minutes, some downloadable spreadsheets and explainers. It's not going to make you an expert, but it'll give you enough in a digestible form to take the next step, to move to the next thing. And it's designed deliberately to be done in the context of your working day. So you can do one of these learning modules over your lunch break, or when you get bored of doing something more tedious, you can pop on over there. What's in the learning modules? We have video explainers, downloads, other kinds of tools. For example, we have what we call a bare bones net present value calculator, which allows you to very quickly estimate the lifetime value of a project by putting in just 9 input variables. And so you can have a wonderful argument with your friends who say, I don't think your advantage is going to last this long. Fine, put in your variables and see what you come up with. So this is an example of what the system looks like and what you can have access to. So for you all, what can you do next? Well, we can give you a demo of the Spark Hub system. It's just moving into production now, so it's just kind of learning what it looks like when it's all grown up. We could also give you a demo of the Learning Hub modules, which are right now we've built 6 of them completely. There's going to be 20 in all when we're done. We've got a bunch of little diagnostics you can try. So we've got an innovation mastery scale. We've got team effectiveness diagnostic. Those are all things we could do. We've got a downloadable article pack we could send you. Obviously, we run webinars and workshops. And I do publish every Tuesday. I publish something I call a Tuesday News Thought Sparks, which is stuff I think is interesting. It's free. You can find it either on Substack, or if you follow me on LinkedIn, you'll get a notification every time one of these drops. And you can just download them. They're all about topics typically related to innovation, growth, strategy, challenges like that. And you can access the archives too if you join on Substack. So that's what I have been up to. That's how I spent my summer vacation. And, let me stop there, and we can turn it over for questions from the audience.
Perfect. Thank you, Rita. Thank you. Now, while you were presenting, I was some of the things that you shared already sparked some ideas and questions in my mind. But let's go to the point of inflection points. You mentioned them very early on in your presentation. And maybe you can quickly share what, from your perspective, inflection points are with 1 or 2 examples. And then I have some questions around them.
Sure. So a strategic inflection point was a concept originally developed by Andy Grove back in the 90s, looking at his experiences at Intel as it went through these wrenching business model and technological changes. So the way I define it is it's some force, typically outside your company, that creates a 10x pressure on some aspect of your business. So 10x cheaper, 10x more faster, convenient, 10x faster, right? So in the case of technological change, take something like the current no code, low code revolution that's happening in software. You're literally able to go now to a company. We're working with one called AirDev right now. You're literally able to go to them and they will produce for you in 3 months what your typical software developer produces in 3 years at a fraction of the cost. And so it's a 10x revolution in what's possible given these new technologies. Now, a couple of things to remember. They don't happen overnight. They don't happen overnight. They happen, as Ernest Hemingway once very famously wrote in a book about bankruptcy. One character asked another, well, how did you go bankrupt? And the answer was, well, 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. And so most of the things that erupt and look at like strategic inflection, look like they happened overnight, haven't. They've been coming on for a long time. In fact, I was joking with an old friend who said, this no code, low code stuff, weren't we talking about this in the 80s when we were talking about object-oriented programming? And yes, we were. I mean, this was a trend that's been underway for a long, long time. So why do established companies really struggle with these? Any company gets born at a particular point in time. And there are some things that are possible at that point and some things that are not. And as you become successful, you develop this recipe for success. And the recipe for success then flows into your key performance indicators, into how you reward people, into how your analysts assess you, into how your banking relationships develop, into your regulatory infrastructure. It's all built around what was possible once upon a time. When an inflection point finally arrives, it changes the ratio of what's possible. So a fabulous example of this is the whole direct consumer movement, in which hundreds of companies have said, we don't need retail infrastructure, we don't need a store. We'll just send you, you name it, razor blades or food kits or clothing or furniture or, whatever. The wackiest one I saw was tourist gear, like gear for adventure tourism. We'll just send them direct to your door. And you buy it and you pay for it and you subscribe to it and whatever. Totally different model. Very destabilizing if you're used to being a conventional retailer where, it's X numbers of seasons and this is your stock levels and this is what you have. And you've got all those metrics that are suddenly less relevant. So that's an example of an inflection point, being the digital revolution that's made access to assets rather than ownership of assets the way to go for a lot of these things. So certainly we've seen retail be very destabilized by this. We've also seen a lot of companies which are substituting almost services for what used to be sold as products. So communication services, for example. So I get calls all the time for people that want to sell me like upgraded office phone systems, and like, why would you want to do that? And if you imagine the traditional PBX system, right, it's being completely disrupted by companies like Ring Central, where it's all kind of in the cloud, dispersed communication things on any device you want, to any device you want, with any device you want. Very, very interesting.
So now you mentioned this gradually and then suddenly. Now, what I see a lot in working with clients, and I can remember clearly, like 4 or 5 years ago, I was working with a large German insurance company. And they were running some leadership courses around Agile leadership. And I was there and I was talking about all of these changes happening. They're like, yeah, but we just had a record year. And before that, we had another record year. And before that, we had another record year.
Sure.
Why should we change?
Right.
Right. And I think it's exactly that point. Like, they didn't even see that gradually piece because they were still like going really well. But I think you and I, probably other people, would immediately see, okay, you're running into a dangerous situation, but you can't see it.
Right.
Now, how do you help organizations see those strategic inflection points in a moment when it is not too late for them to act?
So there's a couple of different ways, beginning with simpler and moving to more complex. So I'll take the simple one first. So I have a survey that we can provide folks that basically says, are you at risk? And it asks a series of very simple questions. Starting off with, my own people don't buy my products and services. The best talent I have is leaving. I'm not attracting new talent that I would really like to get. Customers are saying that competitors, offering something cheaper, it's good enough. So there are all these early warnings, and before they show up in your financial numbers, these are very, very clear calls that your future is not what you might want it to be. Second way that we do this, particularly for publicly traded companies, is we have a metric that we call the imagination premium. And in brief, you take your market cap as an established company, and you can divide it by how much investors are willing to invest in you based on operations. Just how much cash flow do you throw off? And if your market cap is higher than that, what that tells you is there's a little bit more. They're willing to say, hey, I think you've got a good growth story. I'm willing to put a little more money behind that. Now, if you're and the imagination premium is the value of growth divided by the value of operations. So if it's a 1, that means you're sort of evenly split between the two. Now, if you have a low imagination premium, what that basically says is you may be performing perfectly well today, and your investors are going, great, thanks, send us a dividend, see you at the end of the year. But we're not seeing growth. And what we found is fascinating. I mean, we haven't done the statistical correlations yet, but very strong anecdotal correlation between low imagination premium, activist investor, hostile acquisition target, CEO gets bumped out. Bad things happen if investors don't believe your growth story. At the high end, excessively high end, and Elon Musk would be a beautiful example of this, right? It's all imagination premium over there at Tesla. And so he has one bad press conference and his company loses $6 billion of market cap in one afternoon. So being high is not necessarily good. It can be. Amazon's, the last time we looked at it, was close to 4, which means investors are basically saying your cash flow, okay, 1/4 of the market cap of all of Amazon is due to what they actually produce via operations. The rest of it's all growth. And I will say they've delivered consistently on that growth promise for nearly 30 years now. So that's a second way. And then a third way that we get companies to look at the future is this exercise I call the early warnings exercise, which is featured in the book, which is basically think of plausible uncertainties that are important in your future. Then tell a story about each of those conditions. So one uncertainty I've been talking about a lot is, here we are, it's September. Where are we going to be in March? Are we going to be COVID's over, we're back to gathering in person, events are happening, it's great, we can put the pandemic in the rearview mirror to some extent. or not. And then another dimension might be something like, the global economy is picking up or it's not. And that'll give you 4 different futures. And where I think this is valuable is what executives and companies often do is they lock themselves into point forecasts. And then they drive everything to those point forecasts, right? And so what you want to do is expand their range of possibilities they're prepared to entertain. And so that's what that third exercise does. It says you work backward from those future scenarios and ask, what would I have to be able to observe today if possibility A or possibility B were to happen in the future? So you pick a point in the future and you work backward.
Mm-hmm. So now that you've created the awareness, mm-hmm. and they're like, okay, we actually see that there is a risk, right? Mm-hmm. We never know, but mm-hmm. we see there is a risk. How do you get them, people that, and you mentioned earlier, right? Every company was born at a certain point in time, and it has created a business model around that, and it has worked, and it has probably attracted people that can support that business model, manage that business model. How do you get them, and all good innovators are asking this question, right? How do you get them, that organization, which is ultimately that people, do things differently going forward?
Oh, it's hard.
Focus on it, put the budgets on it, put the energy on it, right? Put the
it's
risk
hard. And I'll tell you an absolutely typical scenario. So this literally happened to myself and Ron last year. So we got a call from a company that's in the energy sector, and we have to make time on our calendars, spend time with them. They've got the energy transition coming. They've got a big board meeting coming up in January. This is a hair on fire. Right? This has got to happen. So there follows flurries of meetings and lots of discussion and this and that and everything. Come the new year, I speak at the board meeting. Everybody's aligned. Yes, you're right. This is the direction we need to go in. Absolutely. And then January is, not such a good month. And, that meeting, we'll have to push that back. February's a little soft. And now the quarter's looking not so great. And we get to March and not so great. And then I get to, April and May, and my champion, the guy that sort of brought myself and Ron in, I says, well, we just can't seem to get the executives to focus on this. This energy transition. Now, the reason I love this story is a sort of apocryphal example is there is no uncertainty about whether the business model for fossil-based fuel is going to change. There is zero uncertainty about that. You're looking at governments basically saying by 2050, if not sooner, if we can make it happen, your existing business model is dead, buried, gone. God bless it, right? So this is not a high uncertainty situation where maybe it'll happen or maybe it won't. But to get the energy of the organization focused on that is really hard. So here's what I think it takes. I think it takes leadership that is prepared to look for beyond, what am I doing this quarter? What are my investors yipping about right now? And being willing to take a somewhat longer time frame view. A friend of ours calls this cathedral thinking. And what they meant by that was, if you think about the people in the Middle Ages who worked on cathedrals, many of them did so knowing they would never see their work completed, right? Exactly. But they invested in it because that was a dream that they shared with the people, and they wanted that to be a legacy for their future generations. So I think this notion of cathedral thinking is important. And I don't mean this in a selfless, I'm going to throw myself on the altar of whatever way. I mean, just in a sensible way. Second thing I think you want to think about is, how do you integrate the future thinking with what you're doing today? And a great example of this is what David Cody did at Honeywell. He's got a great book out called Winning Now, Winning Later. And one of my favorite quotes of all time, he says, the problem with the long term, and he says this in his nasal New England accent, the problem with the long term is eventually it becomes the short term. I think that's just such a brilliant way of looking at it. And among the things he did, so I'll tell you some structural things he did. So he came into the company in 2002. And he looked at all his major overhead functions. So IT, HR, finance, I forget what the fourth one was, but the 4 major kind of overhead functions. He says, okay, you guys are keeping your expenses flat at 2003 levels forever. And they all kind of looked at him, well, what do you mean? He said, we're going to grow our top line. We're going to keep our fixed expenses flat. And if you can pull off those two things, guess what? You're now transforming your organization, because they have no choice. They have to get what they need to get done without looking for a lot more budget. So you've created a pressure on the organization to say, this is where we're drawing the line. And then he went to the revenue generating functions and he said, okay, what do you guys need? And they created something they called the Honeywell operating system, which is similar to the Toyota production system in, really creating more agile, more cost-effective processes across the company. And what it eventually allowed them to do was hold the cost equation flat and grow the top line. And if you can do that, that is a terrific recipe for being able to invest in the future.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so when I think about when we talk to organizations, especially when we talk to leaders, it's always like, so how do we create this culture of innovation? Mm-hmm. And there are usually like 3 pillars that we address with them. And of course, there's more, but it's mostly around structures, mm-hmm. around policies, and around metrics. Mm-hmm. Now, the example you just shared with Honeywell, right? Keeping the expenses flat, that's a policy. Mm-hmm. Right? You can't do anything more than that, right? And then going to the others and looking at where can we identify more growth, etc. That's a great example of an organization finding their way. Doesn't have to be every organization's way, but their way to have that somehow pressure, which probably is needed, and maybe that's the next question to you, and then innovate. Now, going into this direction, to what extent do you think pressure is necessary? And then talk about pressure also on people, in many cases being equal to stress and resulting in not so good health outcomes. So how do you look at this topic?
Well, I think there's good pressure and bad pressure. I think good pressure is generating a goal that's perhaps ambitious but achievable. We have a great friend called Shannon Cisco, she talks about 3-year achievable goals. And I think breaking down these grand strategies into, here's what has to be true 3 years from now, therefore here's what has to be true 2 years from now, therefore here's what has to be true a year from now. Hugely valuable practice, because you're getting people focused on, here's the thing that we've got to do. So you have to have clarity around what you're trying to accomplish. Then you have to give people the resources to accomplish it, right? I mean, I have very little respect for leaders who are like, here's your goal, you figure it out. I mean, no, people need to have access to resources. They need to have structural supports. It has to be achievable, right? They have to be able to do it. And I think the thing that I don't agree with so much is this pressure that's sort of punitive almost. It's like, you have to achieve what you said you were going to achieve. In a highly uncertain situation, that's not that helpful. I think in high uncertainty, what's better is to say, here are our working assumptions, and your job, given those assumptions, is to go out and do X, Y, Z. And if you discover something that finds that those assumptions are no longer valid, let's regroup and talk about that. And where are we going to go? Are we going to redirect somehow? Are we going to maybe accelerate? Are we going to discontinue? Are we going to exit? Right? That's the whole principle of checkpoint planning. So I think pressure in the sense of clarity around strategy, ambition around goals, I think those are healthy things. When it starts to get to, unrealistic stress, or people putting, excessive demands on people, or people not being realistic, we've all got lives, we've all got stuff we need to accomplish, we've all got things that are important to us. And I think a lot of leaders or people in leadership roles don't and it's a delicate area, right? Because you don't want to be undisciplined, you don't want to give up on performance and competence and looking for excellence, in what people are doing. But at the same time, if people are facing really big challenges personally, then there has to be a little bit of flex in the system. There's been a ton of research which shows that the thing that causes the most stress is being responsible for something without having control over what that is, and without having control over the resources to accomplish it. And that's what causes stress. So I think if you're going to give people responsibility and goals and push them, you've then got to do your part, right? Which is give them the resources, give them what they need, and give them clarity of direction. And if they get stuck, support them.
Yeah. Excellent point. So a few weeks back, I had the pleasure to talk to Colin Breyer, a former executive at Amazon, author of Working Backwards.
Mhm.
And in that book, they also talk about different types of metrics. Output metrics, which you can influence but not control, and input metrics, which you can actually control, right? Creating a larger selection at Amazon is something that you can control. Having people buy more stuff from you, you can influence, but not control. And now, when you were talking about the things that good stress and bad stress, right? Giving people the thing or things that you can control maybe don't result in that much bad stress or bad pressure. I had to think about these things. Now, in your work, do you also emphasize on those internal or input metrics that organizations can control, in terms of driving their innovation portfolio, etc.?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. So we look at things. So with innovation, okay, you need different metrics in an in-progress innovation. So I talk about three kinds of indicators, which are really three kinds of metrics. So there's lagging indicators, great data about stuff that's already happened. Most of the business information that we use is in the lagging indicator category, right? It's terrific data, but it tells us about the past. Jeff Bezos at Amazon, for example, is famous for when people say, "What a great quarter you had, Jeff," and he'll kind of look at them and say, "Thank you." But in his head, he's thinking, "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. The quarter we just had was baked 3 years ago." Yeah. So then there are current indicators. So things like net promoter scores, employee engagement scores, the health and wellness indexes we're starting to see pop up around, how healthy is my workplace? Those are current indicators. They sort of tell you where you are. The thing people really struggle with, and the things that are most relevant to the innovation function, are the leading indicators. So what could I be looking at today that would give me some insight into what might happen tomorrow? Now, there's a couple of things that make leading indicators difficult. The first is they're often non-quantified. They take the form of stories or suppositions or assumptions, and therefore reasonable people can disagree about what they're telling you. So you might see the same signal and have 3 or 4 people in your company disagree about what it means. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, with respect to leading indicators, we have a terrible habit of confusing our predictions with our preferences. And we tend to see the leading indicators for the things that we prefer would happen, and not even want to look at the things that would tell us, the negative side of things. And the last thing about leading indicators is that they are often made vivid and powerful by the imagery and the symbolism that goes with them, and some people distrust that. So here's an example. I mean, the humans did not want to collectively spend $100 billion fixing what came to be called the Y2K bug. The fact that come the year 2000, a lot of computers all over the world were going to think it was 1900. And, at the time, the warnings were dire. Airplanes were going to drop out of the sky, and nuclear plants were going to become unstable, and we should all move to Montana and stockpile wheat. Well, big moment comes, year 2000 happens. What happened? Nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? We spent $100 billion collectively to make sure nothing would happen. So one of the biggest challenges with leading indicators is, even if people see them, even if they kind of say, yeah, that's plausible, even if they agree, getting them to take action in that moment when they still have time to prepare is really hard if there's some uncertainty about whether this thing is actually going to happen. The pandemic's a perfect example. We were warned and warned and warned and warned, and when it finally happened, just caught flat-footed.
So when you look at an organization and they're like, okay, Rita, help us identify good leading indicators. Mm-hmm. How do you do that?
By working backward. It's probably what that book's about. What you do is you say, okay, if I want to make, I'll use this as an example. There's a great little project that's on Kickstarter right now called the T-Go Adventure Kit. And it's like it's a reimagination of the toolkit, right? And so this entrepreneur would like to make a business out of it. Well, let's say, how much does he have to earn? Let's say he wants to earn $100,000 once the thing is all said and done. What's his return on sales? 20%. So that means the implied revenue is got to be $500,000, just working backward. And then you work back into what would have to be true to make all that happen. And those become your leading indicators, and that you can now month by month watch. So how are we measuring up on the percentage of revenue per product that has to be consumed by manufacturing costs? How are we doing on our cost per unit for advertising? How are we? In other words, you can get very specific about what has to be true for this ultimate outcome to occur.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds so simple, but still, many organizations don't look at those things.
No, they don't.
No,
They don't think about it that way.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it earlier yourself, right? Most organizations are looking at lagging indicators. Some started like a few, or maybe 10, 15, 20 years back, looking at more current indicators like an NPS or employee satisfaction, etc. Now, moving towards leading indicators, it sounds simple, but I think it will take some time for many organizations to realize that, because then they also have to adjust how they're going to spend their money, how they're going to spend the time of their people, their energy, the executives' focus. A lot of this is has to change at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I remember correctly, I think at some point I saw a tweet from our shared friend Alex,
Mm-hmm.
and I think he was quoting you that and I might be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, that one way to see or predict whether an organization is going to be innovative is to look at the CEO's schedule
Mm-hmm.
and how much time they're spending on innovation.
Yep.
Was that from you? Okay.
That's from me, yeah.
Yeah,
he actually calls it the Rita McGrath test.
Exactly. So when you work, and I guess you work a lot with top-level executives, including CEOs, how much time do they usually spend on the future?
The good ones?
The good ones.
25%.
25, so a quarter of their time, right?
Or more, depending on the nature of their company. So if you're the SAS Institute and your entire future depends on being ahead of everybody else in your universe, Goodnight probably spends 50% or more of his time on that.
Yeah. And those who do not spend that much time on the future, on innovation, I mean, they're not lazy. They're still working like crazy hours in most cases. What is it that holds them back from doing that? And I guess they're also smart enough to know that
sure.
Innovation is going to be the success of their company in the future.
Yeah. I think it comes down to this fascinating combination of courage, discipline, commitment, and the ability to stick to your guns on your strategy. If you're a CEO, the world is trying to distract you every second of the day, right? Everybody's got something they want to put in front of you. Everybody's got something they want from you. And so to kind of cut through all that clutter and say, here are my 5 priorities. This is what we're going to do. Here, when I meet you in the hallway, if innovation's important, I'm going to ask you about innovation. We kick off every meeting, let's say, with a future-oriented or innovation topic. Every meeting, not like even the ones that are not strictly about that topic, but it's top of mind, it's awareness at the top of the agenda. And I think, it takes discipline to do that. And the ones I think that drift away from that are the ones that let themselves just get whipsawed by this board member wants that, and this other board member wants this thing, and oh geez, I've got the investor conference next week, and my company ownership overlords want me to report to some 22-year-old about what I did this week. And it's possible to get so enormously distracted by all that stuff. So I think the ones that are really good at it manage to clear that out. So David Cody, who I mentioned earlier, what he would do is he'd literally put a big X on his calendar for a significant chunk of his year, significant for a CEO. And he would use that time for the future, doing plant visits unexpectedly, thinking. He has these blue notebooks he would famously fill up with ideas about the future. But, if you let yourself as a CEO, you have a 9 o'clock meeting and that's followed by a 10:15 meeting and that's followed by an 11 o'clock meeting and that's followed, your day is just like cluttered. And if you can't cut through that to get some really clear thinking time, it's just easy to get distracted.
Yeah. And I think this is not only relevant for CEOs, but for anyone that.
For all of us have this problem. And I would love to tell you, Sohrab, Rita doesn't do that. She's immune from this. I mean, look at my calendar for this week. It's insane. So this is not going to be a very productive week for my writing or for the other things I'm doing for the future. Now, I'm fortunately not in a CEO role, but I become aware that sometimes there need to be some guardrails put around that as well.
Absolutely. And I think we also underestimate to some extent, it's not only like the amount of time that you schedule for something, but also the amount of time in a row so that you can actually go get like, especially if you're like conceptualizing stuff, etc. I remember like when I was a kid, one of the, or not a kid, like when I was growing up, one of the first management books I read was from Jack Welch. Now there's like a lot of different opinions on him, but one thing I don't forget, he said he always has some time scheduled in his calendar, and it's called looking out of the window time. And back then I went to my dad, I was like, so what does he mean by that? He was like, yeah, he just sits there and looks out of the window and thinks about things, and so that he can focus on the stuff that is not his daily work. And that has struck with me. I mean, I'm also not really good at like prioritizing and then focusing, but I think this is important to emphasize on again and again and again, because otherwise innovation is not going to happen. And I love the quote you used. Ultimately, the long term will become the short term. And then suddenly you've missed the inflection point. And then it's even difficult to go into that J curve because you probably don't have the right people in your organization, etc. Now, Rita, we're approaching the end of our session. And I want to give you the opportunity. Maybe there's a few final things you want to share with our audience, and also remember them again about the free content offerings that you have on your website.
Sure. So the website for the new company is called Valize, VALIZE.com. And if you go there, you'll find downloadable resources. You'll find links to other things we're doing. You'll find overviews of some of the advisory offerings that we have. Every Tuesday, I publish a short newsletter, not that short, but shortish, a newsletter about topics I think are interesting. They're called Thought Sparks, and you can find them either on Substack or on LinkedIn. You can subscribe and follow me there on LinkedIn. There are lots of opportunities we can work together. One thing that I didn't mention was I teach a 1-week virtual at the moment Columbia course, which runs next October 18th. And the way that works is it's a block of professor time taught by different people, myself included. I'm there the whole time. It's a whole week. But in that week, you can take a personal project and work it all the way through to the end. We have a professor office hour that Ron Boer and I are going to be co-leading. And it really will give you a toolkit for all these innovation things that we've been talking about. So how do you do a discovery-driven plan? How do you align your portfolio? What do you do about two-sided markets? How do you think differently when you need creative solutions? That's all packed into that 1 week. And so it's the October 18th to October 22nd. You can find out about it looking at the Columbia website. So that's something that I think might be of interest to some folks in this audience. And then lastly, I guess look out for what we're doing as we roll out some of these learning opportunities and as we roll out the software for Spark Hub. Let us know if you're interested, sign up for our mailing list, and we'll reach out to you when we know more.
Cool. Rita, thank you again for sharing your time with us and sharing your insights with us. It was a pleasure hosting you, and I hope we connect and reconnect back in the future.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, and keep in touch. I'm easy to find. Just type Rita McGrath, and you'll find ways to get in touch with me.
Perfect.